So for those of you just joining, my name is Riff Fullen. I'm with Helvetas, and I will moderate today's webinar. And as we wait for the last few people to join, let me just share some technical tips with you. We're all muted, mostly muted, except for me. And please keep your microphone muted during the webinar so the presenters can be heard properly. And of course, if you have any questions or comments at any time, you're welcome to just add those questions or comments to the chat window. There is an opportunity for a Q&A. If there's not a huge number of questions or a large number of people, we could use that opportunity to just speak rather than write, if you prefer that way of communicating. Sometimes that's easier. You see on your screen, hopefully, if you have technical issues, if you cannot hear or see, the best thing to do is just close or leave the meeting and rejoin, because these technical things generally don't get solved in other ways. We will be recording today's webinar, but not for the discussions or having our participation recorded, but just for the presentations that we want to share more broadly after the fact. And also, if we have time, please have your smartphone handy. We would like to do a survey at the end if we have time. If not, then we will ask you, we'll just provide a link to you that you could do it after the webinar, because we'd rather reserve the time for our discussions. So with that, for a few words of welcome, let me hand over to Danielle Maselli.
Thank you very much, Riff. A warm welcome to everybody. It's a great pleasure, of course, to have you at today's webinar. Riff, can you display the presentation? That would be great. The RésEAU, the thematic network of the Global Program Water and of SDC, is happy that we have been bringing together Adelphi, who is developing for us trend sheets and is ready to produce them as a publication, but also then to provide the opportunity to have a webinar on these topics. And it's thus a joint collaboration between Adelphi and our thematic network, RésEAU. And today, the topic of circular economy, we will get insights from the author of the trend sheet, one of the main authors, of Annika Kramer. She's heading the program Water at Adelphi, as you can see on the screen. We then have two presenters. On one hand, we have Keith Röst, scientific researcher, senior scientific researcher, and energy circular systems of KBR. He will present himself as well in a minute. And then we have gender balanced Miriam Otu, Senior Associate, as you see from the Water Resources and Infrastructure Institute, ARD. We then have the speciality, as normally, of having someone from SDC reacting as a discussant to the presenters and to the trend sheet that is the base of this webinar. And it will be Johan Jelly. He headed previously the Global Program Water. That's where when I started in 2019 and 18. He is now the head of cooperation of SDC in South Sudan. So he can also give us a perspective from the field, and he was also at the origin of shedding light into the circular economy. Just for those who never joined such a webinar before of the RésEAU and of the Trend Observatory, the basic intention is to try to anticipate and to understand better new trends that appear related to the sector of water. For us, it is important to be anticipating changes and new things and challenges we might have to face. And in this sense, this is another topic we thought that is of interest, and we hope that you will find something worth for your daily work by following this webinar today. Thank you so much, and back to you, Riff.
Thanks, Danielle. And as Danielle already mentioned, basically we have this kind of a three-part introduction here. First, Annika will give us an overview of the trend sheet looking at applying circular economy principles in the water sector. And then Case can give us some of his experience in relation to applied research that's done in the European context. And then finally, Miriam giving us a more development-oriented look at applying these principles in the global south. and after that we'll hand over to Johan for a brief reaction from a perspective, not only a field perspective, but a RésEAU member perspective. And after that, we will have an opportunity for your inputs, questions, or comments, whatever you may have. So without further ado, let me hand over the presentation to Annika, who can give us an overview of the most recent trend sheet.
Thank you very much, Riff. I'll share my screen and you will please let me know if you see the right view, because that has been a bit of a so I'll share the screen. I'll do the presentation mode, and now you see the screen.
Yes.
With notes or no notes?
No, just the full presentation.
Okay, you still see the full presentation?
Now we see the notes.
Okay.
Or the presenter view, I should say.
Yeah. Okay. And this is not the first slide. Okay, thanks a lot. After these little hiccups in the beginning, let me also welcome you from my side. As said, my name is Annika Kramer. I'm head of the water program at Adelphi in Berlin. And we are implementing the Trend Observatory on Water for SDC. And in my presentation today, I would just like to give a short introduction on circular economy and the main principles and how those could be translated for the water sector. And then only after a short time hand over to Keith and Miriam to give you some more expert and practical insights from their daily work. So circular economy so in general terms, how we understand, if you say circular economy, it's economy which aims to shift away from a linear take, make, waste, extractive industrial model, so where resources are just taken from nature, processed, and then disposed again as waste, to one that looks at reusing resources. And there's no clear definition about what circular economy is. The concept has been around since the 1960s, but has had a boost over the past 20 years. And today, the concept is seen in a bit broader sense. And most famously, the Ellen MacArthur Foundation has defined 3 core principles of what the circular economy entails. It's designing out waste and pollution, keeping products and materials in use, and regenerating natural systems. And I'll come back to those a little bit later to see how those could translate in the water sector. In the water and sanitation sector, we mainly have 3 resource cycles that can be closed. First, of course, is the water cycle. So water that's used in settlements or agriculture industry can either be reused directly without much further treatment, or it can be reused after treatment, either then being directly fed into other uses or recharged to the environment from where it can be extracted again. If we look at the materials cycle, that mainly encompasses organic matter and included in wastewater and also fecal sludges, but also other components such as nutrients and fatty acids or phosphates, nutrients, as I said. Those can be reused after treatment, either with limited treatment, such as where you reuse it as compost, or they can be recovered and completely new products, such as bioplastics, can be generated. And the last cycle is the energy cycle, which is mainly composed of the chemical industry included in organic matter in wastewater and sludges, sewage sludges, but it could also include the kinetic energy included in water flows, or the heat energy, such as, for example, in cooling water that can be reused. Now, looking at how from these 3 cycles we can implement the 3 principles of the circular economy. So the first one, designing out waste and pollution. In a circular economy in the water and sanitation sector, this could mean designing waterless technologies. It could mean water conservation and efficiency measures, or reducing the use of chemicals and energy in wastewater and water treatment. The second principle of the circular economy, keeping products and materials in use, that could translate into reusing water in irrigation industrial processes, which is very straightforward. It could also mean recycling human waste and fecal sludge, as I said, in compost, but also in more processed materials such as lime pellets for fertilizing, or fatty acids that can be used in cosmetic and medical products. It could also mean recovering valuable components such as nutrients, metals, and energy from wastewater and fecal sludge. But circular economy goes beyond that. It also includes regenerating natural systems. So that's very straightforward. It's preventing pollution and other negative effects on the environment by treating wastewater streams. But it can also mean recharging water bodies and ecosystems with reclaimed water, for example, through managed aquifer recharge. Or it could mean returning valuable nutrients to the soil to support soil regeneration, which is also an important part of water systems. So these cycles and these principles can be looked at in systems at different levels. The smallest one is probably the household level, but it could also be looked at the cities or catchment level. And in general terms, we can say that the smaller the system, the closer the supply of effluents and the demand side for the water or components in the wastewater. The closer those supply and demand are, so that would reduce transportation and transaction costs. But on the other hand, if you look at larger systems, of course, you get more opportunities for matching resource supply and demand and then closing circles. So if you look, for example, at industries, if you look at just one company, you might find opportunities for recycling water and components within the industry. But then if you look at take a larger system, looking at industrial compounds and looking at industrial symbiosis, for example, there's more opportunities of closing circles where water from one industry could be reused in another industry with lower quality requirements. And as I said, the larger the system you look at, the more opportunities you can identify. And with this, I would like to hand over to Keith, who will look at how circles can be closed in cities and also looking in the future in 2050. Thanks a lot, and I hand over to Keith.
Okay, thank you. So then I will directly start to share my presentation. Is it in full mode?
Yes, thank you.
Okay, so thank you very much for the opportunity to speak about our project and Drive to Circular Water 2050, where we work on the impact and opportunities of a fully circular urban water cycle. And we do that together with some partners, which are also depicted here on the side of the slide. As a short introduction to myself, I'm Senior Scientific Researcher in the Energy and Circular Systems team at KWR Water Research Institute in the Netherlands. And I also have some other roles also connected to industry. And that's quite nice because in the end circularity is about collaborations and more partners bringing together to deliver in the end the resources that are used again in society. We started our research about circular water 2050 because the Dutch drinking water companies have a joint research program, and they have specially defined circular economy as an important sub-program in this joint research program, where we are focusing on closing cycles and recovery of materials from the water cycle to preserve and enhance the value of water throughout the cycle. And there are different themes depicted here in this slide about quality and climate adaptation, also freshwater reuse, energy, but also efficiency of resources. And this fits very well in the aim of the Dutch government, because in 2016 the Dutch government decided that we should aim for fully circular systems in the Netherlands in 2050, which means that cities are not using the take, make and then dump strategy as presented by Annika, but that we have to reuse, so also recover, reuse and recycle the components. So in the end that sounds very good, but still it's unclear how to realize this and what kind of steps are needed to reach circularity and how circularity will look like. So that's why we have this project as a start, where we have 3 main activities. So the first activity is actually the current situation, where we identified which kind of components are used in the water cycle. So for drinking water production and for wastewater treatment, you use several components, energy to treat the water and to distribute the water. And also from these steps, several components are released, which are have been considered in the past as waste, but we see now these components also as components that can be reused again. And they can be reused in the water cycle, or they can be reused outside of the water cycle. But at least it's important to know what are we speaking about and how is the current situation. Then we also have put a dot on the horizon. So to define circular water in 2050, how does that look like? And we have a nice, I would say, a nice illustration as inspiration. And actually at the moment we are still working on step 3 to put a line between these dots to make a sort of roadmap to define which kind of steps need to be taken and which kind of challenges are still needed to be resolved. So also as a sort of start about circular economy, we investigated definitions, and in the end we reused a definition that was made by the Dutch Social and Economic Council, because we think it defines quite nicely what circular economy means, and that's not only handling products and materials and resources efficiently, so to reuse also these components, but also in a socially responsible manner within ecological preconditions. And of course in the end it's quite in line also with what Annika presented about the Ellen MacArthur Foundation, where we have to reuse components, but also the environmental and natural systems need to be rehabilitated and then taken good care of, but also for the society, so for the people. And that also aligns with the donut economy, where the social and planetary boundaries are used by Kate Raworth, where she identified an ecological ceiling and also a social foundation. And I will go quickly. These slides will be shared, so you can go to read the slides later on. But we use this ecological ceiling and the social foundation as a translation to the circular water cycle. where we see the ecological ceiling as the material flows, including energy and water, that are also materials. And the social foundations are the value for people. And in between we have the system properties to have the space where we can move between the ecological ceiling and the social foundation. And we translated these components, so this ecological ceiling with energy material flows, the social foundation with value for people, and the safe and just space with the system properties in 16 characteristics for the water sector, which can be used to evaluate circularity. And evaluation is quite simple with neutral or negative or more positive. So that's about energy consumption or resource recovery as ecological ceiling. And the social foundation includes, for example, very important public health, because in the European water cycle and the Dutch water cycle, public health is at very high status, and that's something we really should preserve and also appreciate. Also safety and comfort, for example, are very nice, and it would be a pity to get less comfort, and especially also less public health or less safety, and also worse quality of environment when we start to circulate materials and other flows. So that's, in our opinion, also very important in the circular economy, that social foundation is really considered. Then together with people inside and outside of the water sector, we have had several workshops and sessions where we worked on circularity, and also we're thinking about circularity in 2050. How can that look like? So here you see some sketches, and all this information together we bundled, and that is quite a challenge, of course, but we've bundled that in this picture, in this illustration, which should give some inspiration and ideas about circularity in 2050. Of course, we don't have a crystal ball and we can't see how the society looks like in 2050. And on the other hand, also, if you look to Dutch villages and cities, you see also quite some similarities. And that's not too strange, because 2050 is less than 30 years from now. So you can't rebuild cities and villages completely. But still, there are a lot of smaller and bigger changes. For example, in the wastewater treatment plant, it is depicted quite differently compared to the current situation. You see a bit more physical and chemical treatment. And of course, a lot of nutrients and components, nutrients here, and components like hydrogen, but also fibers, the water itself, and other components for building blocks for the economy and for the society that are extracted from the used water. So this wastewater is not waste, but it's used water with components in it which can be extracted, and that's very interesting. Also, the water can go to greenhouses or to agriculture, of course, but also again to the sources of drinking water. So also water is very circular in this picture. And it's not too different compared to now, because also the river Meuse, for example, which enters the Netherlands, is, especially in summer when it's not raining too much, composed of a lot of effluent from treatment systems. I can talk a lot about that, but I have to hurry. So at the moment we are doing backcasting, so that's looking from the future perspective in 2050 back to the current situation, where we have, for example, this mass flow Sankey diagrams, and then trying to make a roadmap and to see which kind of decisions need to be taken, which kind of questions are still open to go to this future circularity. And then a few concluding words. So in our project and program, we are looking to the current situation and how we score at the current characteristics of circularity, because we have this nice scorecard. Then we have a dot on the horizon, and also with this dot on the horizon, we have to decide how far do we want to reach. We principle would like to have everything as plus, 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 but that's sometimes a bit challenging and difficult. But we have to stretch and try to reach that. And with this dot on the horizon, we also look back to the current situation, which we are doing now, and to make it more tangible for administrators, policymakers and planners, how we can reach circularity in 2050. And with that, I end my presentation and thanking, of course, the finances and the colleagues. And then we go to the next speaker.
Okay, thanks, Kees. You've done a great job of showing the complexity of this kind of thing just at the beginning. And then on top of that, of course, you're talking about people and institutions and historical realities that all need to be managed and negotiated. So we'll have a chance to discuss these things a bit further after we hear from Miriam as well, with a more development perspective on the topic. Miriam.
Thank you very much. Can you please let me know if you can see my screen?
Looking good, thank you.
Is it in full mode?
It is.
Okay, perfect. So thank you. You know, the SDC RésEAU, it's a great pleasure for me to present this morning. I'm Miriam Otu. I'm a senior associate at Tetra Tech ARD based in Washington, D.C. We're one of the, you know, world's premier water resources and international development firms, where we use our core expertise in science and engineering to address some of the direst water and sanitation management challenges globally, but also particularly in developing countries. You know, as Riff noted, my presentation is going to focus on the opportunities that circular economy innovations present to address some of the water and sanitation challenges that we see in developing countries. And it's really interesting, you know, having listened to Kees, you know, about the progress and the trajectory that, you know, some developed countries like the Netherlands are on in terms of circular economy innovation, and interesting to see where we are in developing countries. So just to give a really preface, you know, Annika clearly laid out the foundation for the needs and the importance of circular economy. And it's important for me to really highlight the challenges that we're facing in developing countries. And this is because whilst, you know, the conversation around circularity oftentimes highlights, you know, the importance of closing biophysical cycle loops. In developing countries, whilst that is important, the need for us to use circularity to address water as well as sanitation management challenges is even more critical. And we know the challenges that, you know, urbanization bring, you know, exponential increase in population growth in urban areas, and the implications that they have for resource use, the allocation, but also the related waste and sanitation challenges. Now, if we look at this increased demand for resources and we overlay it with climate change challenges, we're seeing in many areas in, you know, sub-Saharan Africa that we're having increasing water scarcity. And as you can see from this graphic, it's a global phenomenon, but you realize that there is a greater prominence of these challenges in the MENA region, but also in South Asia as well as Southeast Asia, and of course in the Pacific. But you see in Southern Africa, as we noted from the example in Cape Town, how the city almost reached day zero and the city was running out of water. And this really brought the discussion around water security to the forefront, and the potential that circularity has to play in addressing some of these challenges. Now, if you look at water scarcity, related to that is also the issue of quality. And so when we're thinking about resource needs and resource allocation, it's not just the quantity, but also the quality of these resources. And one might actually argue and say that in sub-Saharan Africa, we should probably see more red dots because we are all aware of the lack of infrastructure and how that really impacts our surface water, but also our groundwater and its implications for the resources that are needed. In looking at some of these challenges related to resource allocation and resource quality, in developing countries and particularly my own country, Ghana, the lack of infrastructure is significant. These are wastewater treatment plants that are in absolute disrepair, and most times they don't even exist. And so when we're talking about circularity, it's important for us to really ensure that in developing countries, we're moving a step up the value chain to look at where these resources are, these waste streams are, in order for us to be able to actually recover the resources. And so if we're thinking of recovering energy or water from wastewater, the infrastructure does not exist for us to be able to do that. And so we cannot have the discussion of circularity without really understanding the entirety of the value chain. And so this is what we have. If we're going to have a really honest discussion about resource recovery and reuse and circularity, the waste from which you're going to recover the resources are dumped directly into the environment and causing significant water as well as land pollution. Now, Annika clearly laid out, the opportunities and the benefits of recovering, nutrients from these different waste streams, reusing wastewater to recharge the aquifer, potential to recover energy, and so forth. I think we're all quite convinced of the potential, and I emphasize potential here because in developing countries, it's still quite a theoretical concept. And we are seeing that a lot of investments that are being made are into pilot initiatives, and these initiatives are not going to scale. And so the question that I have for us all is, if really circular innovations have the potential to address some of the direst water as well as sanitation challenges, how come we're not seeing any change? And in cities like Bangalore in India, where the city faces significant water shortages, how come we're not able to treat the water, or how come the wastewater is not able to go to tertiary treatment, and we ensure that it's available to address some of these challenges? From our experience and the research that I've done, it's important that, oftentimes when we're talking about circular economy innovations, we place such emphasis on technologies. And technological innovation is critical and it is important. However, the majority of investments, whether by the public sector or by international donors, oftentimes focus on the technology only. And it's important that if we're going to scale these innovations up, to effect the change and address some of the challenges that we're seeing, especially in developing countries, we have to broaden the discussion. Most of these innovations, whether we're thinking of, tertiary treatment of wastewater as drinking water, they're devoid of business modeling. And we understand that, pilot level initiatives cannot continuously be donors cannot continuously invest in pilots. We have to ensure that these go to scale. In most instances, there is no legal or regulatory framework that actually supports these innovations. And so the private sector, they are quite careful or cautious in engaging or investing in any business where the government can decide to shut it down the next day. In terms of its financial potential, we still couch circular economy innovations from the perspective of economic viability. Are they really profitable so that they can incentivize the private sector? And do we have to work with financial institutions so that they really understand that while some of these innovations might be medium risk, they're not as high risk as they think they are. And these are some of the elements or factors that we really need to have in place that will incentivize private sector capital. And in terms of partnerships, we tend to throw around public-private partnerships quite loosely. I think in developing countries, the issues around partnerships is not necessarily about the modalities of the partnerships, but just what the opportunities are for public as well as private entities to actually engage in some of these interventions and initiatives. And so having these elements that really would support an enabling environment in mind, I want to present a couple of cases here that have really hit the core and addressed some of these factors and that have ensured the sustainability of some of these interventions and really created an opportunity for them to be scaled up. So this is a project by the International Water Management Institute, my previous organization, and it was funded by the Gates Foundation, who provided seed funding for the setting up or the establishment of a fecal sludge to an organic fertilizer production entity, business actually. And so this graphic here shows on your left, access to toilets, emptying and transport, treatment, as well as disposal and reuse. Oftentimes when we talk about circular economy, we are only focusing here on the green column, the product that is recovered and its use. We fail to understand that it exists within a broader value chain. And here, because it's fecal sludge, it's within the sanitation value chain. And it is critical that while we have to understand the core entities that are engaged in the business, in this case it was the municipality and a private entity called Jacora Ventures, it is important that we pay attention to the other component subsectors of the value chain to ensure that all of these elements are working together and they're a clear win-win. There's a clear win-win for all parties to ensure its sustainability. If we look at this business model here, it's indeed a public-private partnership, and they have a very clear revenue sharing mechanism. But it is important for us to look also at different opportunities to generate revenue, particularly at the startup phase of the business where cash flow can be a challenge. And so with this model or this initiative, it was important to see how the processing plant could generate revenues from the entities that actually brought the waste to the treatment plants. And so partnerships will extend beyond just the public entity and the private sector entity here, but also to look at the partnerships with the people that are emptying and collecting the fecal sludge and also the municipal solid waste. With a new product like Fortifex, what it's called, it's important that you take advantage of the established marketing and distribution channels of even a competitor like chemical fertilizer. And this is what the project did in order to be able to really increase its access to the market. Now, what was an important lever for this initiative? It's the legal framework. Jacora Ventures, the private entity, was not willing to invest in this initiative because there was no policy that allowed fecal sludge reuse in agriculture. And we didn't know this even whilst we were designing the project. And so it was important for us to really work closely with the Ministry of Agriculture and EPA to put together a policy that allowed the use of fecal sludge in agriculture. This product is a direct competitor also for chemical fertilizer. And the chemical fertilizer is typically subsidized in Ghana. Now, if this product is going to be competitive on any level, the prices have to be lower or at the same price as the subsidized chemical fertilizer. And so it required a lot of advocacy on the part of the project to really educate the Ministry of Agriculture as well as the Ministry of Finance to include organic fertilizers in the subsidy program, to ease the market entry of businesses like this in the entire fertilizer sector. And so I put technology here to really note that whilst the technologies are simple, drying beds and use of the ponds and windrow composting, and it is really tailored to the context of Ghana and can be easily replicated to other developing countries, these elements related to the legal framework, the partnerships, the business models are the true levers to ensuring that these are sustainable and that they actually go to scale. The next example that I have is related to energy recovery. And this model or this example really addresses the issue of resource availability, but also sanitation challenges that are pretty prominent or that we see in many urban areas. Now, we know that in Eastern Africa, in countries like Uganda as well as Kenya, most middle as well as low-income households, they depend on solid fuel like wood and charcoal for their household cooking as well as heating needs. And we are also aware of, coffee processing, agricultural processing industry. This has caused significant deforestation, and so the countries have put in very clear policies to address this, along with really strong enforcement mechanisms. Now, this resulted in the market for charcoal, for example, almost immediately collapsing. And so we see that the introduction of a regulatory instrument has the potential to create a new market for circular economy, resource recovery and reuse products, where we're seeing now that there are small micro enterprises, but also large scale businesses that are even exporting to neighboring countries, producing waste-based briquettes. And so we see how here a regulatory instrument can be such an important lever for circular innovation, circular economy innovation in developing countries. With the existing market, we also see that it has really low startup capital, depending, of course, on the scale. And so it has great potential to improve livelihoods, particularly of women and of youth, and of populations that are in emergency contexts that, for example, live in refugee settlements, who are no longer just transient populations, but they have lived in these settlements for decades. And these populations oftentimes face very limited access to resources, and they don't have livelihoods. And so this is a great opportunity to look at some of these circular economy innovations to improve their livelihoods, but also address the sanitation and waste management challenges. These are one of the few examples that we're seeing that has a really strong and justified and proven positive return on investment, really incentivizing private sector pumping their capital into it. And in addition to the simple technology and the low capital, these are able to be scaled up quite easily, and we're seeing this being replicated in many countries in Eastern Africa. There are many emerging and promising cases like this. Some are going to scale, some not so much, and I didn't cover wastewater because of time, but we can always discuss it during the Q&A. But in order for us to really get some of these initiatives to scale, there is so much more that we still don't know. And research is really critical and important, and really need to, and governments as well as international donors really need to recognize and really invest in research for circular economy. And I emphasize your action research because we need research that is really designed with implementers so that the uptake as well as the sustainability strategies are inherently built into the research so that the findings are easier to be taken up, whether it's by government or by private sector. I pose a couple of questions here. And this really ties in back to the need, what is really needed for us to be able to scale up these amazing technological innovations so that we can actually effect change. We're seeing that blended financing is, being taken up and, increasingly being used to address water supply issues. It's growing in sanitation. Is there potential for us to explore this for circular economy? And what really are the legal and regulatory frameworks that will not just support circular economy models, but that they are sustainable and that they're equitable? And can we truly reverse the economics of sanitation in that now we have, for example, with fecal sludge and the example that I gave in Ghana, they pay the treatment plant or the, the compost producers to bring in their waste. Can we reverse the economics where we actually pay them for bringing the waste, which will now be a resource and an input into businesses? And as I noted earlier, we tend to couch circular economy innovations as economically viable. Are they truly financially viable? Can we present circular economy innovations without considering the externalities, the positive externalities to justify investment? These are all questions that we need to understand. And it is so much more than research. As I noted, pilots have not been they have not gone to scale as we expected. However, pilots are still important because we need proofs of concept. And these, of course, to complement the action research that I referenced earlier. And we need to build capacity, and capacity, really tailored capacity to the private sector, because private entities that are already engaged in the sanitation sector or water sector are interested to invest in some of these innovations. And of course, the public sector as well, so that they can invest in research, but also invest in infrastructure, so that we move beyond just the discussion and the inclusion of buzzwords in policy documents about green growth. Households and communities are the recipients or the consumers of these recovered resources, and we really need to educate them, understand their behavior in order to be able to design educational programs so that it is not just an abstract concept, but for them to really understand the role that circularity plays in resources being available for them, such as water, common drinking water. And of course, supporting the development of regulatory frameworks. I'd like to button up my presentation by saying that and re-emphasizing that technological innovations are really critical and important, but we really need to broaden the conversation beyond technological innovation. And we need to really refrain from referencing factors around the enabling environment as soft components. These are critical and important factors that will ensure not only the sustainability, but ensure the uptake of some of these circular innovations. And so before we're able to have a discussion about where we're going to be 2030 or 2050 like it's being done in the Netherlands, there are significant challenges and issues that we really need to understand and for governments as well as international donors to invest in. Thank you.
Thank you, Miriam. And you've also added richness to this picture of complexity and the various factors that we have to think about and have to confront when it comes to finding solutions. Before we go to a Q&A part of the webinar, maybe I could invite Johan Jelly to provide his reaction to the various presentations. Johan?
Reef, can you please, is it possible for you to stop sharing my screen? I'm having a bit of a
Sure.
difficulty doing so.
Yeah, many thanks. Good afternoon to everybody. Can I start?
Thank you.
Yes?
Please do, yes.
Many thanks. Yeah, very interesting presentation. Congratulations to the three presenters, Yannicka, Myriam, and Keith. Extremely rich. Congratulations to the RésEAU. We are speaking about a 5 decades RésEAU, Swiss RésEAU. Congratulations for the work you are doing, of course. Of course, through the presentation, especially the last one with Myriam, we have understood that there is many challenges or specificity with respect to the global south. And I would say even more specificities when you come in a country like South Sudan, which is extremely volatile and fragile, but still there is some source of application in this kind of country. As a summary, what will be important, because circular economy is not a new phenomenon. What we need now is really acceleration everywhere. On congratulations, Keith is very happy to learn what is currently being done in Netherlands. And I would have a dream with respect to the experience in Netherlands, but also in Switzerland, but also Myriam, you are in Washington, maybe from US as well, is 2 things. First, how the principles which are currently applied in Netherlands, Switzerland, US, but as well as the opportunities can be to some extent, with fine-tuning to the local context, can be transferred also to the global south on countries like I'm living in here today. And I think there is a lot of possibilities. Myriam, you were mentioning research. When we spoke about research, of course, I'm thinking about how the multinational companies, the big companies, can put at the disposal of the global south part of their research, or how they can also develop. You were speaking about innovative partnership. Maybe in the research area, you have the public research financed by Switzerland, US, Netherlands, but you have also multinational which are carrying out a lot of research. How this this research can be developed through specific partnership, for example, between multinational, but also socio-entrepreneur. And I'm sure here some socio-entrepreneur dealing with circular economy at a very local level can benefit from some research being done in other contexts. Decentralized cooperation as well, Netherlands, US, Switzerland. How can we develop new kind of partnership, maybe from some cities, maybe New York is extremely advanced, but also in Netherlands, but in Switzerland, how they can develop some very clever partnership, city-to-city partnership, decentralization, with a focus on circular economy. And another aspect which is to me really important when we speak about policy development, framework, etc. You have a definition in Netherlands. We have one in Switzerland and in other contexts as well. How can this? How can we accelerate the transfer with respect to road mapping, with respect to dashboarding, with respect to scorecarding, with respect to the definitions? How can we accelerate the transfer of all the experience already made in other contexts to the global south? That will be an interesting things to be developed also to accelerate again with the idea of acceleration. What was extremely interesting as well is what you said, Myriam. Yes, we have to understand that there is some specificities. When it comes to the global south, we have to be careful. We are not at the same, in many different contexts, we are not at the same stage of the value chain. So we need some specification, we need some fine-tuning. With respect to the technology also, you said a lot of things, and that will be important if the RésEAU can also compile experience with respect to the technologies, because again, we have to broaden the set of technologies, and we need to make sure that the technology are extremely tuned to the local context, whatever the context. With respect to partnership, I spoke about that. The need to go to scale, I totally concur with you. We need to go to scale, we need to accelerate, but we need to be extremely clever on innovative in terms of the design of the partnership, the design of the institutional framework, the design of the normative and policy framework. This requires a lot of cleverness and innovation, but there is so much energy here in these kind of countries that we can tap in this energy. Then, of course, marketing. There also, I think, clever partnership between multinational, big companies who are pro in terms of marketing to help the social entrepreneurs here in these kind of countries might be extremely helpful to address the issue of marketing on one side, but to address the issue of advocacy and awareness on the other side. This is not only the duty of the local authorities or national authorities, but we can learn a lot from the private sectors to accelerate again the level of awareness on advocacy. So many thanks. With respect to the financing, I will conclude with this. With respect to the financing, again, we are seeing in the water sector more and more emission of bonds, bonds for water, blue peace bond for transboundary water management. Very recently also a lot of bonds related to mangrove. Why not starting to think about the emission of bonds in fragile state, but also in developing countries? I know that there is some bonds which are related to the circular economy in Europe and in Northern America, but maybe it is time to be courageous enough to start to design very specific bonds to accelerate the financing of the circular economy in this kind of context. Voilà, sorry, I had a lot of issues, sorry. Thanks.
That's okay, thank you. I mean, obviously there's quite a lot to discuss, and unfortunately we only have about 3 minutes left in the official time, so I would propose that we, those of us who can stay, at least try and extend it by 5 minutes or so, because I think the points raised are quite important. So what I would propose is a combination of things. First, any reactions to Johan's comments, either around the bond idea or the sharing of research idea. And I also see that Case posed a question, which was basically the question I was going to ask, which was, I mean, sometimes we can get bogged down in all of this complexity and the difficulties and the challenges, but really, practically speaking, is there a first step, or are there, is there some low-hanging fruit in terms of trying to move these kinds of initiatives forward? And so I would open up the floor to, at the moment, because of the shortage of time, to Case or Miriam, to begin with, if you have particular things you'd like to say in response to any of that.
Miriam, go ahead.
Okay, all right. Thanks, Keith. I think that Johan has comprehensively captured the entire conversation in really, really clear bullets, and it's excellent. In terms of partnerships, I absolutely agree with you, Johan. Partnerships not only related to the innovation and uptake, but partnerships for research, partnerships to incentivize private entities to also invest in research, and it shouldn't only be governments, but also the multinationals that are going to benefit from these circular economy innovations. Now, and maybe related to the question about where do we start, is partnerships, I believe, are one of the most difficult to actually establish and ensure their sustainability. It's easy to put things on document and say, well, we have an MOU, let's work on this together. But when it comes to actually putting funds into this MOU or this intervention to do research, then we begin to see some of those challenges. In terms of the financing piece that you referenced, Johan, and the use of bonds, certainly there's great potential there. But I even think with bonds in water, there's a lot of still limited clarity on the different modalities and its use. And I think that this is an opportunity for us to really understand what these financing mechanisms are, what will work and what won't work. And we need to be able to understand that it's important for us to invest and spend time to understand what works, and not just envision that we have these targets for 2030, 2050, and so we have to achieve them by any chance possible. It's important that we continue to invest time and resources to really understand it. In terms of where do we start in the global south, I think regardless of the market, regardless of the technologies, we need a supporting legal and regulatory framework. Without it, private sector will not invest because these interventions seem too high risk for them if a policy is going to come tomorrow that will shut down their business. So I think the first start, and it's important that we hold governments accountable, that they put clear regulatory and legal frameworks that really allow, and it's clear what is allowed environmentally, to ensure that we are not solving one problem but creating another. With fecal sludge as an organic fertilizer, it will increase soil fertility, but what are the implications for groundwater contamination? This still needs research. In the short term, maybe not, but in the long term, the potential, we don't know whether it's negative or positive. And so I think the starting point is really working with the relevant stakeholders to ensure that we have very clear regulatory and legal frameworks for resource recovery and reuse in developing countries.
Okay, thank you, Miriam. I see your hand is up, Johan. I don't know if that's on purpose. Before I hand over to Case, did you have a direct response to Miriam?
Yeah, very fast. Many thanks for the first part of your intervention. With respect to the emission of mold, you are absolutely right. This is a very green market, which is absolutely not mature. And for that, we need to be extremely clever in the design of potential bond. And with the public donor, bilateral donors, multilateral donors, along with multinational, we have to address part of the risk or entirely, or the risk in total. Not leave the risk for the local authorities, etc., etc. But we have to assume the risk, but not alone with multinational, because if the multinational are going to invest in this market, it might be, it might pay off on the long run. So we should not be the only one to address the risk issues, but also the multinational. Sorry.
Thanks a lot. Yeah, and over to Case.
Yeah, very short. I try. The topics of the Global South and that Miriam and also Johan are mentioning are in a large part also valid for Europe and the Netherlands, for example, because also their legal frameworks and organization is missing about circularity, because the legislation is made for linearity, and if you are going to reuse components from sources that are used, they also have these pathogens and contaminants, and also in the Netherlands and Europe, we are struggling with the legislation and what kind of guidelines do we need for secure and safe reuse of components. So in the end, that's more similar than you might expect, and also a big similarity about cooperation and collaboration. I mentioned it in my presentation. If you want to close cycles, very common usually, it's not done by one organization or one person. So you need to collaborate and to work together. And by doing this, you also should share the benefits and the possible less nice parts. So paying for it, for example. So you can't leave one organization paying and the other one taking all the benefits. So that also is a sort of reorganization of governance. And yeah, all these aspects like governments, legislation and monitoring are as important as technology, because with technology we can do a lot. We can recover a lot of resources, including water. And as a last point, I would say starting, in my opinion, we're starting. So I asked the question, and it's very difficult, but starting, where are the opportunities? So for example, if you have water stress, used water can be extremely helpful. And then also end users might want to invest in this source of water. But of course, we need to do it in a safe and controlled way. And that's very important. And with that, I think we need to help each other in the world with the different organizations and the different people in the different countries to learn from each other and to share the results as much as possible, so we can have a nice circular and safe circular situation as soon as possible.
Thank you very much, Case. And indeed, it's a lot of it is, I think, practically speaking, about identifying these immediate opportunities, and that might require some initial analysis. But before I wrap up, I just want to make sure, Annika, if you're not sitting there waiting to jump in, I want to give you a quick opportunity at this time.
Thanks a lot, Ruth. Yeah, I'll be very short because I'm really happy that we had Miriam and Kees here to share their experience. And actually, my answer on Kees' question, so what would be the first step, would have been the same, like looking at the legal and regulatory environment. So that has been said by Miriam. And but another point that I think is important is that we should also not overburden the circular economy concept with expectations of generating economic benefits, but rather see it as an opportunity to contribute to the financing of water and sanitation services and creating revenues for probably some intermediaries. But sometimes my feeling is that if you think of circular economy and water and sanitation, the expectation is that it should really generate economic benefits, and I think we need to be realistic there and still not dump the idea in general and still acknowledge the benefits that it can bring, even if not in economic terms, then in environmental and maybe social aspects, if we look at sustainability entrepreneurs and people that get better access to sanitation, etc., and some of the effects that cannot be measured in monetary terms. That's
Thanks,
my finding. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. Yes, and thanks to all of our panelists for a very rich set of presentations and even if it was brief, also discussion. So the good thing is that the presentations will be shortly available to people. And you can see the link in the chat window, as well as a link to a very brief survey of 3 questions just to ask you about your impressions of this webinar and how whether it contributes to your thinking on the topic. Certainly, there's a lot to be discussed, and I think this is a good kickoff point. As you said, Annika, at the very beginning, it's not a circular economy is not a new topic, but maybe for many people working in the water sector in a development context, particularly, might find it to be relatively new. And as we're all becoming systems thinkers these days, it should be also attractive, not just new. So we look forward to within the RésEAU, I think this issue will continue to come around more than once, I'm sure. So thank you again, and thanks to everyone who's been able to participate. Hope you enjoyed it, and we'll see you the next time. Have a good morning, afternoon, evening, depending on where you are. All the best.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.